Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. My name is Justin King. I am a director at Milltown Partners, the organizers of the AI Fringe, and I am very happy and pleased to once again be joining you to be your host this morning. In November last year, the official AI Safety Summit was held at Bletchley Park. This summit was attended by senior government representatives and major organizations focused on AI, from those developing it to those deploying it, to those closely examining its use and role in society. This was the start of an international conversation between a set of governments, regulators, civil society, and industry. Now, Bletchley had an express purpose, exploring how our global community can manage the frontier risks AI poses collectively to ensure a safe and beneficial future for everyone. It was from this moment that the AI Fringe was born. Our aims as an organization were threefold. First, while being complementary to the AI Summit, the Fringe would broaden the conversation to go beyond the topics discussed at the Safety Summit, to not just focus on frontier AI safety, but to a broad range of topics as well that were of interest to the AI ecosystem. Second, the Fringe was created to ensure broad participation from a range of perspectives across civil society, academia, and industry. And finally, our aim was to create an inclusive space, providing a platform for all communities, including those who had been historically underrepresented in the AI discussion, to be a part of this conversation. The Fringe events were held over the course of a week across 10 different cities in the UK, with the center of activity being right here in central London. Over 5 days, the Fringe team and our 19 partners welcomed 113 speakers from across the AI ecosystem and over 1,200 guests who attended the event. It was truly a fantastic occasion. Now, I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation, and I know it's early, so I won't make you speak. But who here attended the AI Fringe last time around? Please, by a show of hands. Amazing, fantastic. Welcome back. We're really excited to have you join us again. And for those of you who weren't here the last time, we're very happy that you're here for this conversation today and that you are a part of this community. So, what are we doing in the coming months? For 2024 and 2025, the Fringe is back, and we're excited to continue to be in service to the AI ecosystem. This is particularly true as the AI summits go global. While we are a UK-based organization, we're delighted by the links that we have built with governments, industry, academia, and civil society in South Korea and France. It is our pleasure to welcome some of them here today. The return of the Fringe kicks off with this morning's event. It brings me a huge amount of pleasure and excitement to welcome everyone back to what feels, or what's beginning to feel like home, the Knowledge Center at the British Library. 3 weeks ago, the Republic of Korea and the UK governments co-hosted the second AI Summit in Seoul. It featured a number of key developments, including reinforced safety commitments, expanded discussions on innovation and inclusivity, and the publication of an interim international AI safety report. Was there anybody here who was at the Seoul Summit? By show of hands. Nope? Well, we have speakers here who will be able to talk about it, so we're really looking forward to that today. Now, we're going to spend today's session bridging the Seoul Summit and the upcoming summit in France. We'll spend time reflecting on the developments since Bletchley to ensure the safe development of AI and how to harness its benefits. We'll also hear perspectives, again, from those who are involved in the Korean Summit, and we'll look ahead to the AI Action Summit in France that will happen in February 2025. The Fringe will be present there as well. Now, for the final bit of audience participation, just by show of hands, can you please identify if you are from an AI or technology company or indeed any other company, just by show of hands? Civil society? Great. Academia, and that includes students as well? Fantastic. And otherwise interested members of the public? Love that. Fantastic. Well, it's great to see so many organizations represented here, so many different perspectives and so many different walks of life. Now, it will not have escaped anyone that we currently are in the midst of a general election campaign here in the UK. Now, you'll notice when I asked for a show of hands, I didn't ask for any civil servants to put their hands up. We know that PIRTA has understandably placed restrictions on politicians and civil servants participating in this event and indeed actually attending this event, but we're continued for your grateful collaboration to help develop the Fringe. The question of how governments, both here and around the world, approach AI will be one of the topics that our panels will cover today. Now, before we dive in, there are a few housekeeping notes that we need to cover. That was excellently timed. If you have phones, can you please put them on silent? Videos of all sessions will be available on our YouTube channel soon after this event. We invite you to join the AI Fringe conversation on social media. Our X, or formerly Twitter, handle is @AISummitFringe, and the hashtag is #AIFringe. You can also find us on LinkedIn if you search for AI Fringe. We'd like to thank you in advance for all of you here for supporting our code of conduct. It's very important to us and listed on our website. Fire exits are at the front and the back of the theater. And now, let's get started. The first Safety Summit brought the issue of AI safety to the top of the international agenda. 6 months on, it's time to take stock of where we are now and where we need to go in the months and years ahead on this important topic. Our first panel will discuss progress since Bletchley, including the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety, how the AI safety conversation has evolved at the Seoul Summit, and what we need to bear in mind ahead of France. Now, if you will please join me in welcoming our first moderator to the stage, Vincent Manacor, Senior Technology Reporter for Politico.
Hi, welcome to the first panel, the AI Fringe. My fellow panelists are now coming to the stage. I'll do a very brief introduction of them. Of myself, firstly, I suppose. I'm Vincent Manacor. I'm the Senior Technology Reporter at Politico. I've been covering, as you can imagine, a lot of AI policy in the last few months. Rishi Sunak's AI Summit, what the AI Safety Institute has been up to. So I've really got a great panel with me today to discuss those topics. I have people from inside the leading tech AI companies, Sam Pettit from Google DeepMind, Serafina from Cohere. And then I have civil society represented, which is obviously very important, Fran Bennett from the Ada Lovelace Institute. And then we have the lead writer of the State of Science report, the Yoshua Bengio report, Daniel. So thank you for coming today. I just wanted to start, because I'm a journalist, I'm obviously very focused on the election right now. Yesterday, I sat through the hour-long debate between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and AI tech policy wasn't mentioned a single time, which is a bit disappointing for all of us in this room. I was wondering, and I'll ask you first, Fran, is it a good thing or a bad thing that AI policy isn't really in the crosshairs for the UK general election?
I think it's actually fine. It would be a strange public debate if the first port of call was to think about AI policy rather than the other challenges that are facing us right now. So actually, I really want the AI policy conversation to be following what are people's actual concerns, what do we actually need, what problems do we face, and then how do we put the AI and the technology into work to solve those, rather than making AI the hero and everything else has to follow. So I think it's actually fine, and it would, I can't imagine what the conversation would have been if they did try and debate that, but it would have been painful to everyone in this room, I suspect, to watch if they did that.
Killer robots.
Oh, don't.
Sam, what are your views on the kind of lack of the conversation around?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it would be surprising if first TV debate AI was high on the agenda there. I think something might have gone wrong if it was. I think it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not attention being paid to it either. I think manifestos will come out in a couple of weeks or so. I think we can expect lots of concrete ideas and thinking from both the main parties and beyond on how the UK can maintain competitiveness in AI, how can we adjust the risks and so on. So I think, yeah, there's broad political consensus there on this being important. Whether or not that's reflected in the debates, I'm not sure that necessarily means there's like attention or not enough attention being paid to it.
Okay. Just to kind of keep on the theme of the election for a minute before we talk about the summits, Labour has said it wants to introduce an AI bill. We're not yet quite clear on what will be in that bill, but they've said that they want to at least make some of the safety commitments mandatory. Do you think we need that now? Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of making commitments mandatory makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's obviously a very complex picture, and I don't think legislation is the only part. I think you also need to think about institutions and regulatory gaps. So do our current regulators have the resources they need? Do they have the powers they need to actually make this stuff safe? Or do we have gaps? So not just thinking about like one bill and that's it, but just what is the ecosystem of governance that you need to roll out technology safely and have it realise the benefits that we want.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask the two representatives of the companies in the room. You know, both of you signed the recent Frontier safety commitments. They're voluntary. We've seen a few voluntary commitments so far. Is that enough? Do you think we need? Would you be happy to sign, or to sign up to mandatory? Not that you would have a choice, I suppose, but do you think we need mandatory commitments?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I to some extent agree with you that like there is a benefit to mandatory commitments, and like even though I'm from a company, for instance, sometimes there's something that I think would be good for me to do, but I don't necessarily have always the resources to do it because I might be at a competitive disadvantage, and so forcing everyone to do it is nice. That's not the case that much because I think at least one of the benefits of the sort of AI safety scare is that there did become market pressure, I think, to some extent, to include safety, like people got scared. So we do have, it is still easy for companies to do that, and I spend quite a lot of time doing it, that's my whole job, and Cohere does. But I still think there is something beneficial about mandatory stuff. I think as far as the existing commitments go, though, like my worry about it is that the people who are setting them will be too divorced from the sort of real problems. Because I work predominantly with enterprise use of models, which means, problems that are existing when someone uses our model in an HR context or in a healthcare context or something. And so the things that can go wrong are very specific to those contexts. And so I would be, I'm pro them if they're done well. But I suppose the devil is in those details. The commitments as they stand now are sort of so vague that you can interpret them any particular way, which is one of the reasons why we signed them, I think.
At least that's honest.
Well, I mean, we, partly because, because a whole bunch of companies that disagree on quite a lot signed them, right? It's one of the ways that you get them to. And in the conversations they said, you can write out your manifesto for what you would like these to mean. And so sort of at a high level, it's almost like people say like, oh, are you against cancer or something like that? Like the thing that people disagree on is how to fix it, not. And so similarly, it's like, do we want to measure our models and make sure they're safe and that they don't cause societal harm? Absolutely. How we want to do that differs. And so we signed them because we can interpret them as the ability to mitigate real world harm and the sorts of ways that our models are used, whereas some people will be interpreting them in more speculative ways. And if that was mandatory, that would upset me.
Sam, were they vague enough, Google Teams?
Well, no, we were pleased to sign them. I think you've seen a lot of progress based on the voluntary approach for now. I think it's the right place to start. So I agree. There's obviously lots of space and a commitment from the companies to define how they'll uphold those commitments through safety frameworks. I think the fact that you'll have 16 companies, with really broad global representation, publish those by the time of the next summit in France, I think that is really meaningful. And it's also then a foundation that you can build industry standards for responsible capability scaling upon. So I think it's like an important first step. Those frameworks will be scrutinized. We published our own one, the Frontier Safety Framework, a couple of weeks ago. Whether or not over time those need to become more mandatory, I think there will be a place for well-scoped governance frameworks on safety and testing. I think a couple of important considerations there, though, for essentially the question of timing. One is that I do think they need to scale iteratively as AI becomes more and more advanced. That's really important. You need to be careful of over-regulating at this stage and doing too much. And the second is that there's just a lot more work that needs to be done on the foundations for any mandatory regime for it to be effective. So, best practices on evaluation, standards, benchmarks, and so on. I think there's a lot of good work that's been done off the back of the summit on those areas, and that really needs to be a priority for now. So, we'll see what happens with any idea of a code, and look forward to seeing the detail. But I think there's some really important considerations, and there's a lot of progress being made so far.
Okay. Sorry, I said I would move away from the election, but I wanted to talk about, obviously, Rishi Sunak has made the AI Summit. The AI Safety Institute has kind of focused on AI quite a lot. You could argue it's formed part of his legacy, or will form part of his legacy. If we're looking back on 5-10 years from now on the initiatives that he started, what kind of judgment do you think we will? What do you think we'll make of it? I suppose you could argue that he really brought AI safety into the mainstream. He propelled it up the global agenda. But there have been questions about how effective the AI Safety Institute has been in terms of doing pre-deployment testing of the models. I'd be interested to know what your opinions are of what Rishi Sunak's really achieved in this space. Sorry, I didn't direct the question, did I? Fran, I'll begin with you.
Okay, wow, tricky one. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'm not a political commentator, obviously, but thinking about how things have moved over the last year, I think having safety summits has been helpful. I think Ada Lovelace Institute had a lot of frustration at the first one about the fact it got so focused on existential risk and didn't take the bigger picture of, well, what is AI and machine learning more basically doing right now, and how can we make that work for us? So I think starting that drumbeat of summits has been helpful. I am really happy to see at Seoul it's sort of starting to shift and broaden the conversation, not just to the existential risk thing, which I think is one specific piece. And having AI in the conversation has been really good. I think our conversations about the benefits of AI are still not developed. So I think there is still an assumption that there's a magic capability and a magic wand here which will solve all problems, and that's sort of probably going to come out in the party manifestos, I suspect, as well as the sort of black box solution to lots of things. I think I would love to see a more mature conversation about what do people want from this technology, and then how do we make that happen. And I think it is a technology which can do lots of things, but I think it's being driven by excitement about the bleeding edge of tech more than by what do we actually want from it right now. And I'd love to see the human and social perspective in the centre of that much more.
Daniel, maybe I'll bring you into the conversation. Obviously, you're the lead writer on the latest report. Has it been helpful having politicians like Rishi Sunak really bringing this into the kind of political sphere for someone like yourself?
Yeah, by the way, I loved your attempt of saying the full name of the report earlier. That was the fate of basically everybody trying to say the name.
Yeah, I feel like it changed the name a few times as well.
A few times, and it's expanded. Yeah. And then everybody does what you did, saying, the Banjo report. Yeah. I think, I was just thinking about your earlier question in terms of potential legacy. I think a lot remains to be seen with the AI Safety Institute and what the UK government has done. One thing actually to add on the previous question, which I think is relevant, particularly from an EU perspective. So I live in Berlin, been following the AI Act conversation and dramas quite closely. And what the EU are experiencing now, for instance, is they're building up this AI office that's tasked with implementing some of the rules from the AI Act. And I think seeing what AC have been able to do in terms of hiring technical talent and getting them into government, and like actually top technical talent, that has set like a precedent, I think, for other governments to also aspire to. And I think that's been very valuable. The report, I think, initiating that process has also been very valuable. Kind of a weird thing for me to say. I'm very biased in that sense. Curious to hear what other people think, but I think it's the whole conversation around AI is so messy, to say the least. And there is so much uncertainty or disagreement, depending on how you want to frame it, among experts. Even within sort of for individual experts, there's so much uncertainty. And what I and a lot of people I think have been experiencing when talking to policymakers is that they're in this situation where they just want to know what is going on, or what do we know, what do we not know. And it's really good, I think, to try and create this fairly authoritative source that connects it all and writes it all down and has sort of very broad participation. So for this report, I think 75 international experts overall contributed to it from a pretty diverse range of perspectives and sort of niche specializations. So I think that's valuable.
I was skimming the report yesterday, even though I didn't remember the name. And I was struck by how there's quite a lot of disagreement in different areas in terms of like how close we are to kind of AGI, whether that's even possible, the kind of safety implications of the technology. From the outside, it's quite confusing to kind of look in and see this kind of level of disagreement about kind of almost the fundamentals. How was that kind of process of, I guess, talking to people who really disagree about it?
You mean writing?
Yeah, sorry, writing the report and, bringing those views together.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, maybe the aspect I was most curious about going in. Overall, I've been very impressed with how, like, the constructive spirit with which everybody has approached this. It's also been, yet another reminder that what happens on Twitter and the tone on Twitter is just really not representative of how people normally think and interact with each other, even when they're, like big important experts with big egos and differing opinions. So that's actually been pretty heartening, I think, for me, to see that there are, of course, like the few sentences or sections that you go through like 30 iterations on them, but there's a common understanding that even though the other person disagrees, they have a valid perspective, and it's about finding the right phrasing and the right nuance in the writing.
I wanted to ask some of the other panelists about this, these open questions which came out of the report. Is it beneficial to you? Does it help you in your job to have such kind of open disagreement, or is it actually more of a hindrance that there isn't a kind of clear perspective out there?
I think it's right to be open about them. Yeah, so it's about identifying the right questions, tracking development. I assume it might be like an annual report, and I think that could be, well, depending on the like whether that's doable or not. But I think providing a regular assessment of where we are, for example, on scaling laws and how they're holding up, I think could be really useful, and providing like false certainty would be unhelpful at this stage. So I think it's a really important effort, super ambitious, and would be really like a really valuable input to future summits, but also for national governments as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I started my last answer talking about how unhappy I would be if I had to do mandatory X-risk stuff. But I definitely think the field has come pretty far as far as finding the things that we do agree on to some extent in the last, I don't know, less than a year actually. Because, we found things such as that, if you're worried about, for the people who are more worried about the X-risk stuff, they might care about the spread of like persuasive capabilities or something along those lines is one of the things they care about. But like I care about that as well from a different angle of if someone's trying to use my model to spread misinformation in real life or something along those lines. So we've done a little bit better of a job of finding like areas where it's sort of required for both parties. And I think that at least is a good thing.
Still focusing on that, I suppose the first summit, which was the Bletchley Summit. For those of you who were there, what were your kind of main takeaways from that event? Do you think that it achieved what it was set out to achieve?
Bletchley or Seoul?
Bletchley first, and then we can get on to Seoul.
I thought Bletchley was a really useful event in that it got government, civil society, and industry together in a room on a pretty even footing to have a serious conversation about the serious things we needed to talk about, and I think that's really positive. And the fact that this is leading to a series of summits is very helpful. I think it actually did do what it wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think getting 28 countries plus the EU in a room together is a really important first step. Seoul, we'll come on to it, but I think it's maintained that group, and I think that momentum and sort of country dialogue is going to be really essential. I think Bletchley also delivered some concrete outcomes, and I'm sure we can discuss what that looks like, but I think the sort of interim report is obviously one really concrete idea there that's hopefully going to expand and become more entrenched. On the industry side, we've been working with the Safety Institute on testing. It's also, I think, helped encourage labs to continually evolve their approaches to safety, because people are interested in this and they're keeping track of what we're doing, and I think that's really important. So I think it's providing a forcing function for lots of progress in between the summits, as well as sort of specific outputs that are delivering things as well. So I think Bletchley was obviously the first, and therefore really important, and maintaining momentum is going to be crucial.
You mentioned testing there, and I couldn't resist to, return to that topic. Google DeepMind, according to reporting that we did, was the only company that allowed access before release to its models. Does that? How does that make you feel? Do you think that you've put yourself at a disadvantage there compared to your competitors, or is it you want to really kind of embrace that collaborative spirit with the institute?
We're very keen to work with the institute. I mean, it's definitely additive, and that kind of Daniel was talking about, but that state capacity, I think, is really, really important. Labs need to invest in evaluations and so on, but the governments need to be doing that as well. We see it as really important, something that we're very committed to doing. It's definitely exploratory. I mean, it's early days for that type of work, and it will evolve, but I think it's a really important muscle to build. I think the progress the Institute has made in staffing up, attracting really world-class talent, providing a foundation for things like the network of safety institutes that were announced at Seoul. So I think the UK really has been a first mover on that state capacity, and we think it's really important, and we're keen to keep partnering with them.
I mean, one thing that kept cropping up in conversations that I had, and I wonder what your opinions on it are, is there's this the issue of how do you get around the kind of breakneck speed of development, and the fact that these companies are in a kind of a race essentially to develop the next products. How do you get around that, and also the ability to kind of let governments in to test, because obviously that's going to slow the process down, and that companies aren't going to want that. How do you get around that issue? Sorry.
For me, I mean, I think it's a mix. That there's important aspects of pre-deployment testing, but there's also post-deployment. So I think it's sort of the idea that it's like pre and then a model is launched. I don't think that's quite right. It's going to be continual. Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily put it as this important marker. I think there are lots of things, risks that only become evident once you have deployed a model. And obviously it's really important that you make best efforts to make sure they're as safe as possible prior to launch, but that's not always the case. The Safety Institute has done some work on jailbreaks, for example, and those are the types of things where people are creative and find ways to adversarially probe these models, and you can only really get that insight once you've deployed. So I'm not sure this pre-deployment, post-deployment thing it's as binary as that. And I think the Institute, I imagine, will do a mixture of the two, and that feels important. Yeah.
Okay.
Just to build on that a little bit, I mean, this comes back to our conversation earlier about voluntary commitments versus sort of binding commitments as well. I think that companies are under a lot of commercial pressure to keep releasing and keep expanding. So carefully thought through binding rules about when do you have to stop, I think are very helpful in just preserving safety when companies are under enormous pressure to compete with each other and to keep releasing and releasing. Which is very hard for them to not do, frankly. Unless there's an external force saying, actually, no, that's we can't. So.
I mean, I think one of the clean, like, non-regulatory, since we're talking about regulatory and non ways of getting around that is by having we're sort of assuming that the pre-deployment testing, I mean, I agree with you that pre-deployment and post-deployment actually are fuzzier than that, and that sort of the idea that you can test once and then it's done, and you have your rating and your model is like safe or not is sort of like, it would definitely be a false sense of security, and it is very weird. It's like everything is this ongoing process, because if you're talking about harm reduction as, you know, you're not wanting your model to discriminate in the real world, but also you not wanting to enable malicious actors, like people don't stay the same, their strategies don't stay the same, that sort of thing. So I agree that it's fuzzier on that angle. But I think also there's sort of this assumption, you know, like we did not do it, but partly it's because there wasn't anything additive. Like it's not that we don't do pre-deployment testing, we do loads. And to some extent, I would love it if someone did extra for me because like I could do more, but it would have to be something that I think matters in order for me to do all the engineering work to give them access and stuff like that. So I think, you know, you can give someone a carrot as well to some extent. Like if I felt like it was going to make my models safer and better for not so much effort to me, then I would love to do it. And I think that's more because a bunch of the work that came out of Bletchley Park and other things is more awareness, such that the whole industry is more aware of safety things that you need. And there's more clamoring for it than there used to be, which is a really good thing. So I think that's one of the things that's sometimes missing is that, if they worked with different companies about like, what are you scared of? What matters for you? Like what type of pre-deployment testing would give you useful signal? Then I think providing those incentives would be great.
Okay. And something I'm interested in is like how, and this is a question for all of you, is, you know, we talk about testing, we talk about evaluations, but how developed is that science? You know, what stage are we at? Like, how well can we even test these models before we talk about like, you know, whether they're safe or not?
Yeah, there needs to be a lot more work on evaluation. A lot more work. Yeah, I mean, earlier when I was talking about the vagueness of the commitments, I think one of the reasons why they are is also because the science is not very far about, like if you want to make a commitment about like an exact safety measure, you need some amount of science such that you can measure it, like simulate it, you know? Like if you have a self-driving car and you want to know the chance it will like run off the road or something, you need like statistics around that, and we actually don't have loads. And there hasn't been that much work on it. And you have this sort of secondary problem of that you have, if you're measuring at a foundation model level, which like I would be, quite a lot of changes happen between when I use the model and then when it's actually deployed in the real world. And there's not a lot of science on what sort of difference those make. So your bounds on what your possible model behavior could be are just too wide currently for you to set anything as exact as I think people would like. So there needs to be a lot more work on understanding sort of the relationship between what deployer changes matter, both to the model, but also even stuff like to the interface. Like people don't talk about that, you know? Like if like people are worried about like spread of misinformation maliciously and unmaliciously, like someone accidentally getting misinformation, like something like the way you display information to people actually matters. And people are not sort of including, or the corpus that it's retrieving from. People use RAG systems, and it's like what is in the data that your model can present you also matters. And these are things that like I have no access to. And so I think there definitely needs to be quite a lot more work on the relationship between what you can predict at a foundation model level, and then what needs to go, what needs to happen later, and how strong the levers are on each side.
I said we'd move on to the Seoul Summit. I'd be interested to hear from those who were there how it was different to Bletchley, what progress you saw. Did it build on? How did it build on the outcomes of the first summit?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I think, it was different in lots of, few things were the same. So there's the same group of countries, which I mentioned, which I think was really important. There was, continuity, momentum, and I think that was really the objective, at least from my perspective for the summit, was to keep pace and keep things moving. I think it's delivered some concrete progress. So there's obviously the Frontier Safety Commitments, which 16 companies signed. I think will lead to sort of a really good foundation for industry best practices. I think there was 3 or 4 country-led agreements, and going through those, I think you can pick out some really good progress there. So countries now are going to set up this, or at least 10 countries plus the EU will set up the network of safety institutes, and I think collaborating on the sort of the science of safety at a country level is going to be really important. It's obviously then going to be the next iteration of the what we're calling the State of the Science Bengio report. I think it moved things on really significantly and delivered some concrete progress. Lots more to do, but I think, I know that we can maybe discuss sort of key themes, but I think it moved things on from just talking about safety in a relatively narrowly defined way, as was at Bletchley, which I think was a good place to start. But there was lots of conversation around the idea of systemic safety. So what happens when these models are deployed in the real world, and how do you sort of monitor those? There's also inclusion and inclusivity. So I think it represented a much wider conversation about the impact of AI, and that can only be a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it did feel like in some ways the conversation moved on to include those things a bit more. I mean, it was a lot more low-key than the Bletchley Summit.
Yeah.
Smaller groups. Civil society weren't really there. Companies were sending their lawyers rather than their CEOs. So, I mean, maybe it's because that was the sort of halfway point to the French one, which is intended to be bigger. So it was good to see. I mean, I keep saying this, but it would be really great to see more concrete movements from governments out of this. The UK government, as always, was saying, we won't rush to regulate on any of this. It's all hard to know, all very exciting. So I'd love to just see more voice of conversation about what we want from the technologies, and then how concretely are we going to shape that. I know that's a hard ask, but trying to keep moving towards that and keep pushing towards it, and including public voice as well as governments and industry, I think is really important.
I know that a criticism of the Bletchley event was that civil society wasn't as represented as it could have been. Do you think that improved at Seoul?
No.
Okay.
I mean, at Bletchley, civil society actually was fairly strongly represented, I think. I mean, I'd always love more, but there were a decent amount of civil society representatives in the room, not representing the whole world, by the way. I think it was very much UK, America. Yeah. Seoul was not really that, but I think partly because it was a much smaller event. So at France, again, it would be great to see really good cross-section of representatives of people and society, basically via civil society organisations.
Well, what are the risks to you of not having those voices? And you mentioned there that even with civil society, it was mostly from America and the UK. What's the risks of not having a broader range of voices in the conversation?
Well, I mean, I think it's the perspectives that are in the room, right? If industry is thinking about building technology, how are we going to build it? I mean, they are thinking about how to roll it out safely, but from a very specific perspective. Governments, have a lot of geopolitical concerns going on as well, and so you need civil society in the room, and the people affected by the technology, or people representing the people affected by the technology, to get that angle in as well, which is just such an important one to the conversation. I think you need to bring all of those together really to try and solve for the questions that we're all, I think, thinking about.
Mm-hmm. And having now done 2 summits, what do you think is still missing from the process? What would you like to see at future summits, and perhaps also, between the summits, does there need to be more work, working groups, for instance? We talked about this.
Yeah, I think that type of work could be really useful. So if you look at Bletchley and then Seoul, there's been sort of relatively, what I would say, substantial outputs that have been worked on ahead of time. I think making progress in between the summits, I think through working groups on specific topics, could be really good. They need to be really well scoped and like focused to make sure that they actually drive real progress in between the summits, but I think that could be good. Particularly if they move to an annual sort of like cadence, I think that seems likely after France, so you don't want to wait a whole year. So I think that could be pretty useful. I think thematically, I mean, we've gone from sort of frontier safety quite narrowly defined to a broader definition of safety. I think it looks like France are going to be thinking about a broader range of topics. So I think making sure that, at least from a Google DeepMind perspective, we really want to make sure there's a dedicated forum on frontier safety. I think the summits have been really additive there, and they complement other forums like the OECD, the G7, the UN, and others. But making sure that that we retain that clear focus, I think, will be really important.
Any other thoughts on what could be improved?
Yeah, go for it.
Just adding to what Sam just said, my experience from talking to policymakers is that they're sometimes a little confused currently as to where these summits fit in the everything else that's going on internationally. And I guess that's probably a natural thing as everything emerges and you have the G7, the G20, UN stuff, OECD, and so on. But sort of finding a place, sort of an anchoring to something else, or like a pathway to how is this at some point going to lead to something more substantial. Yeah, it's not I don't see it as a real deficit at the moment because we're early on in the process, but I think there's like a common understanding that needs to happen, focusing in that direction.
Yeah, I would say, like, somewhat contrary to you, actually. I'm very happy about that there is a movement towards expanding things beyond a focus on frontier safety for the reason that fundamentally, like if we think about what these summits are, they're a cross-disciplinary space. And like I know about my model weights, that's what I spend every day doing. I don't necessarily know everything about the dynamics of threat actors in the real world. I don't know every marginalized community that's affected by my model. And that's the sorts of things that like governmental bodies can tell me more about. People who work in like more social sciences can tell me about. And so I think the real value that I see actually is in the expansion of the conversation to sharing these types of expertise in a way that we can work together rather than having like a strict model focus. I think that's what seems really valuable to me.
Yeah, sorry, just very quickly on, I agree the expansion scope is useful. I think I just don't see those as mutually exclusive, essentially. So I think making sure there's still a dedicated forum on safety as well as like the broader conversations, I think is definitely a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, we can, looking forwards, obviously the French summit's coming up. They've renamed it. It's no longer AI safety, it's AI action. I think there's like 5 different work streams they want to work on. It seems like a much broader scope. I'm wondering if there's perhaps a danger there that it becomes, it's slightly diluted, dilutes the purpose of these series. I was wondering what your opinions are on just kind of really broadening out the focus of these summits.
And I think actually broadening it is a good thing, but as you said before, I don't think it's mutually exclusive. So I think there are a number of things which these technologies touch on, which is why we all struggle so much to work out what to do. They touch on many areas of life. It's a very interdisciplinary conversation. And I think just breaking that into a series of conversations which we want to have, some key topic areas, some key perspectives, I think if we can cover the ground but in a coherent way, I think that's the ideal.
Daniel, what about you? Do you think it's a good thing that the French summit is really broadening out the subject area?
Yeah, basically, as Fran was speaking, I was thinking, I think it's about the how, not about, you can do this really well and then sort of cover a lot of ground that so far maybe has been all over the place, and then you have it bundled in one sort of institution, the summit, or you can do it very poorly, or it can go very poorly. It's not just about the organizers, but all the stakeholders contributing. So I think I'm pretty agnostic at this point, and hope that it's good. Definitely one failure mode I can see is that, this basically becomes just a woo AI summit, and all the big names go there, and then there's a lot of handshaking, and it's yeah. But I guess that's pretty independent of, you know, are there 5 work streams, 1, 2, or 7?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I think I don't have a strong opinion on this question.
A woo AI summit. I think that's the quote of the session. Yeah, Fran, what do you think? Do you think what do you want out of the Paris summit?
Oh, I think, you know, for Motion on all these conversations, I mean, I think we can't get away from that. There will be a bit of a woo AI thing because everyone has to have it. And I think also, I don't think any of us could bear another conversation, which is, what are the risks and benefits of AI? I think just no one's there for that.
It's going to happen.
I know, but oh, please, no more. But I actually like a real conversation about these issues and bringing together people who wouldn't normally have those conversations is a real benefit. And then a commitment to what are we going to do out of it is the real thing. Like, don't just go have the conversation and go home and forget it. It's like pushing more progress, I think, is the key thing.
I've been asking questions now for about 40 minutes. I'd like to, I think, open it up to the room at this point. If you'd like to raise your hands, I think that there are mics going around. Do we know where the mics are? Okay. This gentleman in the second row. One thing before we ask questions, can we please make sure the questions are fairly concise and actual questions? Thank you. And please introduce yourself.
I'm Jazz Russell. I'm director of the AI Coaching Alliance. We're looking at how AI can be adopted into coaching practices. The question I've got for the panel is trying to move away from that conversation about risks and benefits for a while. And of all the things that you think are important in terms of lenses through which AI can be looked at, I've been looking at least 7 that are to do with compliance, coherence, congruence, as well as competence. Of those things, amongst business coaches, I've noticed for them what's really important is just to get competent, but unfortunately what's become more important recently is to be coherent and congruent with AI being used in environments and scenarios. So I just wanted to ask each of you, of those 4 lenses, compliance, coherence, congruence, and competence, if you were just going to pick one and say, let's start with this and run the race with this, which one would it be?
Who wants to handle that one?
I could very briefly say it really depends on your use case. I don't think you can pick one which is above all, right? It's like how are you using it, and then those qualities are important in different situations.
More questions? There's a man there right now. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andras. I'm a data scientist, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think of open sourcing as a strategy for making AI models and large language models safer?
Yeah, I'll answer that because we have an open source model. We have open source and closed source models. I'm super excited about it. I come from a research science background, and it is a really good way to basically crowdsource discovery and research work, right? It makes people familiar with how your model works. It makes people, when you have a broad set of scientists using it in lots of different settings, they can discover all sorts of cool things because you're bringing a bunch of perspectives into the room sort of automatically. So I think it's just really, really augmentative. Like, we have differences between our closed source and our open source models for like commercial reasons and stuff, and deployment and sort of, but we can learn a huge amount, and the community as a whole can learn a huge amount. Like, I think people sometimes forget that AI has come really far, really fast, and a lot of that has been because of the openness of the community, because until quite recently, almost everything was really open, and so when you don't have things siloed in labs, everyone's like standing on each other's shoulders instead of kicking each other in the shins. So I think it has like huge potential, and I'm really excited to find out what we get. We open sourced our model pretty recently, so I'm excited to see what I learn about it.
Actually, I've got a follow-on question on that. The AI Safety Institute recently open-sourced its evaluations platform. I'd be interested to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I actually think it's one of the things that impressed me about them. I found them hard to work with originally for the X-Risky type reason back at Bletchley last year. But I was really impressed by it. I think it's pretty well done from an engineering perspective. And I also think it can address, it's not additive on what I do because we already have loads of evaluation suites, of course, internally. But for the reason that I mentioned, that like we need to evaluate things more downstream. And many people who use our models have less resources. And so I think it's like a pretty nice toolkit. And I think there's a lot of room for enabling smaller players without resources to do more safety evaluations and checks themselves. And I think it's a pretty good step towards that. So I was quite impressed with it.
Any thoughts, Sam?
On the inspect framework?
Or,
yeah, I mean, yeah, agreed. Like, it looks really robust. We spoke to them about it. I think it will help get some sort of commonality between different safety institutes and how they're approaching things. I think, yeah, it seems like really impressive work. I think just on open versus closed source, more generally, I think that's obviously not necessarily a binary choice. I mean, there are lots of different options between those two things that might be appropriate depending on level of risk posed by the model and so on. I think at Google DeepMind, we've open sourced a long track record of open sourcing things. AlphaFold, recently open sourced our family of JAMA models. I think there is, as these models become more and more capable, I think there needs to be conversation about where do you draw the line there, because obviously there are risks too, and once a model is open sourced, that can be, that's irreversible, and they can be fine-tuned for harmful purposes. So there was some really good conversation at Seoul, actually, I thought, about open source. I hope that stays a theme at future summits. Definitely needs to be talked about more, including in the context of like global inclusion, because I think there was lots of interesting conversations about the role in open source in democratizing access to AI, but equally lots of the risks potentially could be global in scale, and there's a tension there. So yeah, that seems like another area that France and beyond should definitely focus on.
Thank you. More questions? Second row here.
Hi, Pravita Dayalan from RPC. I'm a lawyer. I thought it was really interesting what you said, Serafina, about the gap perhaps between the evaluation of the foundation model and the eventual use case and deployment. It's hard to predict how it's going to be used and the risks inherent in use cases. And as developers of foundation models, or perhaps others on the panel who have a view on this, what is the balance to be struck between placing safeguards on your foundational model and then still preserving its commercial viability and the ability for it to be used in as many good use cases, useful use cases as possible? And what is your responsibility as foundation model developers to almost safeguard compliance at that level as opposed to later use cases?
Yeah, so basically, I think the analogy that I've used, I have done what research exists in the relationship between the upstream and the downstream. And so when I've explained that type of research that I've done, I've usually used the analogy of genetics, that you can have a genetic propensity for schizophrenia or breast cancer or something, and it may or may not surface depending on environmental factors and how you live your life and that sort of thing. And that's mostly what research shows about foundation models. So I think we have, which isn't really answering your question about commercial viability, but almost just about what's actually scientifically possible. So I think we have a responsibility to make it so that if someone uses our model out of the box, which a lot of people will do, it's pretty good and pretty safe. And also that that it doesn't have this super high genetic propensity for cancer, I guess, if I continue with this analogy. We have a propensity to make it so we can minimize the risk as much as possible. So that, if someone is naive, because some people will always be, or if someone doesn't modify it, is naive, or just has mostly fine data and deployment, that our model will be fine. So I do think that responsibility lies with us. But I think, but we will never have complete control because, we can have the most perfect model and if someone gives it bad enough data and like a bad enough deployment situation or fine-tunes it in enough of a way, you can take a perfect model and it can have really awful impacts in the real world. And that doesn't answer the commercial viability standpoint, but I think that's sort of, it will always have to be a blend in that sort of way. If one of you want to answer any bits of it?
Quite a few questions. Okay, towards the back there, second row from the back. I think third row from the back.
Thanks. I'm Susie Madigan from CARE International, which is an international humanitarian relief organisation, and I'm leading a research project at the moment to look at the perceptions of AI by Global South civil society and civil society organisations. So just picking up on so Serafina and Francine's comments earlier, Serafina, really great to hear you say that not to acknowledge that AI labs can't always know the very varied different potential harms on all of the different types of marginalized communities out there. And so I guess it's like, picking up on Francine's comment about, we've had so many conversations about risks and opportunities of AI, but perhaps the gap is really understanding those risks and opportunities in that real sharp edge in humanitarian development context, and really understanding, what something might mean down the line for a teenager in Somalia, a girl in Somalia further down the line. So my question to the panel is, what do you think are the best ways, the tangible ways to build those pathways from those lived experiences of communities in Global South communities, remote from AI labs, and how can we actually create that co-creation of technology to make it meaningfully safe for everybody? Thanks.
Who wants to take that one?
Well, it's a tough one, but it's a really important one. I think it's a very hard question, right? Because we're talking about encompassing the entire diversity of human experience in a real way in the development of technologies. So you're never going to come up with a perfect solution. But one very important part is just keeping the importance of those perspectives in the conversation. So not letting ourselves lapse back towards the frankly more comfortable thinking about model weights, because we're all nerds here, we all like that, and it's all very containable and understandable. So keeping those perspectives in the picture and keeping coming back to how are we going to include those perspectives, making sure things like the summit really do seriously make the effort to represent those perspectives, to have lived experiences as part of the conversation, and current and potential near future lived experiences, I think, are really important and are typically not in the picture right now. So for example, at Bletchley and Seoul, I think the only representative from Africa was the Rwandan digital minister, and she was great, but she was talking mainly about economic opportunity. So there wasn't a sense of, there's an entire continent missing from this conversation, which seems like a big gap. So trying to just bring that in much more to the conversation and keep iterating on it and trying to really, have those people at the table, I think is the only way we do it. And that's not a simple to implement thing, and we have to appreciate that, but I think we can't not do it.
Great, thanks for that. More questions? I think we have time for a few more. There's a lot of them. Maybe we can actually do them in a batch. So there's two over there. Sorry, that's not very specific, is it? To the left, to the left there. Who's got the microphone? Sorry. Oh. Yeah, sorry, yeah. The middle row. If you can put your hands up again. So yeah, you two there, if you can ask them, one after the other.
Sure. I'm Abby Burke. I'm from Public First. I was wondering, and this is for any of you, where you think that conversations around the environmental impact of AI fit into discussions of AI safety, and if how you feel about including that more in future summits.
Hi, I'm Carson McEwen, current MSc student, regulatory background. I will sort of reflecting on what you're saying about the conversation about the benefits and risk of AI. Totally see where you're coming from, but I'm also very conscious that I think the majority of the public just don't understand the benefits and risks of AI. You know, killer robots, and especially considering that, you know, some of the risks can arise from those kind of end users and how they're using AI. I was wondering, how do we bring, you know, more people along the journey with us without diluting the progress of the AI safety conversation?
Yes, so two questions there. One, the last one on how do we make the public understand AI, and then that's the first one. Who wants to handle those?
I can start by saying that that's basically one of the goals of the interim report now that we published, and then the full report later on, to first get all these experts together with very different perspectives, and then try to, I don't really like this way of saying it, but to sort of dumb it down, quote unquote, or make it, you know, really accessible, so that a policymaker who's had a really long day and is in their Uber back home can read it and be very tired and still understand, you know, the essence, but also a layperson that just plays around with ChatGPT sometimes and doesn't have a technical background. And then just adding something about the first question, again, from a report perspective, the interim report that we publish now has a brief section on the environmental impacts, and you know, very explicitly not making an announcement about the next iteration, but personally speaking, I wouldn't be surprised if that is going to be longer in the next one, because I think a lot of people also just expect that as you know, as we have the more and more advanced models and use more and more resources for training them, this conversation is going to become more important.
Does anyone want to handle the first question?
On the environmental impacts? Yeah, well, I think it's definitely something I think that could be discussed at future summits. Obviously, it's covered in the report. As no guarantees it's going to be in the next version, but I think it seems like it would be useful. I think for that type of sort of systemic risk or systemic safety in that context, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, Daniel, but it sort of seems to me that there's a challenge on identifying AI's net impact in those types of areas, because obviously there will be you know, there will be environmental impacts in terms of energy usage and so on, and that's really important to track. But equally, there could be really useful applications of AI in climate science and weather prediction or optimizing energy grids or whatever. And it seems like it's going to be important to find out, identify AI's net effect there, and that seems really difficult, particularly for a report that's focused more on risk. But it seems like something that, for policymaking, is going to be really important to at least try to do, and there are trade-offs and they're difficult to judge, but can't be overlooked.
Well, true, and definitely there is, like, you know, and that becomes extremely complicated if you think about, like, you know, does it remove someone's tedious admin task who is doing climate modeling or something like that, and then you have this, like, huge ecosystem that's exploding, which is why it's hard. I mean, I think LLMs aren't really used for climate modeling, and are not necessary for it. Other big AI models are, but not necessarily in the NLP space, which is what most people are thinking of in their mental model. But I think this is a really interesting one, because incentives to make it better are already there to some extent, right? Like the operating cost of like both from like a we care standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint, you know, we spend a whole bunch of time trying to make our models efficient and use less compute, and like because everyone's operating cost is mostly compute at this stage. So it's interesting that it feels like that one, improving that at least, like it should be part of the conversation, but improving it is more of a coordinated effort. Like most people don't own their cluster necessarily, so and then also just needing to have more technology that makes it better, but we're already incentivized to do that. So I feel like it's almost different than some other things where you need to incentivize some people. But the space is already going to have to move there, because everyone who uses one of our models wants it to be smaller and more efficient, and to some extent, as much as possible, while still maintaining performance. So I think that one is interesting in that I think the real growth area there will be in the coordination angle of like people who run like data centers and stuff like that with companies. So it's different than other ones in that way.
Yeah, and I think it is really important to get into, right? So there's the energy and the water impact, and as you say, you've got a natural incentive to reduce that. But I think what I would love to see in the near term is just some more benchmarks and some more clarity around what are the actual impacts right now, like how much do these models use? I would challenge that, like, well, what's the net effect? Because we might solve climate change. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But I think people sort of really skip over the thing that is definitely happening now, which is the consumption of energy to build models, and set that against a very, frankly, undescribed future benefit. As you say, LLMs aren't generally involved in this, so actually it's sort of a weird balance to do anyway. So just trying to get more clarity on what are the current impacts, and then we can weigh up, are we okay with those? I mean, I think without that information, it's very hard to decide.
Great. Well, I'm being told to wrap up, so I think that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists, and you've been a great audience asking really good questions. Thanks so much.